Lucius Cornelius Sulla is a figure who embodies the complexity and ruthlessness of ancient Rome. A man whose name has become synonymous with power, cruelty, and survival during one of the most turbulent periods in Roman history. From his early military campaigns to his undisputed rule as dictator, Sulla faced challenges that would have destroyed less determined men. However, he not only survived these trials, he turned them into stepping stones to achieve unprecedented power. Sulla began his military career as an ambitious young noble, making a name for himself in the wars against Jugurtha and Mithridates, where his brilliant tactics and courage earned him hero status in the eyes of Rome. But his true mark was made during his political rise, when, amidst the civil war, he marched on Rome, the first time a Roman general dared such an act. This audacity was not just a display of strength, but a redefinition of the rules of power in Rome. Despite revolts, betrayals, and powerful enemies, Sulla emerged victorious in every confrontation, consolidating his power and instituting reforms that would shape the future of the Republic. His ability to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges, from brutal internal struggles to formidable external threats, cemented his legend as a ruthless general who, against all odds, survived it all. In this video, we will delve into Sulla's life and military career, exploring his campaigns, the strategies that led him to victory, and how he became the dictator who redefined Rome's destiny. Get ready to discover the story of a man who, through his cunning and determination, survived one of the most chaotic periods in Roman history and left a legacy that still echoes through the corridors of power. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was born into a patrician family in Rome, a declining nobility that left him with limited wealth but a powerful name. From an early age, he showed an unusual ability to navigate the political complexities of the Roman Republic, understanding that rising to power required both military skills and political alliances. Despite his unremarkable origins, he used his intelligence and cunning to stand out. Observing the power struggles in the Senate and the Roman legions, Sulla realized that his destiny would be shaped on the battlefield. It was during his early military campaigns as a military tribune under the command of Gaius Marius that Sulla began to distinguish himself. Although Marius was the dominant figure at the time, Sulla was already proving to be a shrewd and ruthless strategist. He did not just follow orders but began to develop his own tactics, closely observing the dynamics of war and how to exploit the weaknesses of his enemies. His quick grasp of the enemy's vulnerabilities and his bravery in battle started to draw attention, laying the foundation of his reputation. During the wars in North Africa against Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, Sulla had his first major moment of glory. Although Marius was the commander, it was Sulla who managed to capture Jugurtha, using his cunning to negotiate with Numidian allies and bring the war to an end. This victory was crucial in cementing his position in Rome, but it also sowed the seeds of rivalry with Marius, who felt overshadowed by his young subordinate. From this point on, Sulla began to chart his own course, stepping out from the shadows of his superiors. Politics in Rome was in a constant state of upheaval, and Sulla, even as a young man, knew that military strength would be his key to power. He began forming alliances with other senators and political figures, laying the groundwork for his advancement in Roman politics. However, he also understood that to survive and thrive, he needed not only to win external battles, but also to navigate the internal ones, where betrayals and intrigues were common. His coldness and calculative nature soon became one of his greatest weapons. Sulla's early campaigns served as a crucible, where he not only proved his battlefield skills, but also began to build his reputation as someone who survived any situation. Even without the robust financial and political support that many of his contemporaries had, he managed to maneuver with precision. The capture of Jugurtha was just the first of many feats that would set him on the path to becoming one of Rome's most powerful men. The war against Jugurtha was a pivotal point in Sulla's life, not only as a military victory, but as the moment he began to forge his own name, separate from his mentor, Gaius Marius. Jugurtha, the king of Numidia, had proven to be a cunning adversary, evading repeated Roman attempts to capture him for years. The conflict seemed endless until Sulla decided to use his own tactics. He approached Bacchus, Jugurtha's father-in-law and an unstable ally, offering him an alliance in exchange for betraying Jugurtha. Sulla demonstrated his ability to negotiate not only with a sword in hand, but also with sharply chosen words. He managed to convince Bacchus to hand over Jugurtha, promising him political favors and a privileged position with Rome. The risk of relying on a foreign leader was immense, but Sulla took a high-stakes gamble and won. When Bacchus delivered Jugurtha in chains, the young Roman commander secured his first personal strategic victory. Although Marius was the official commander, it was Sulla's name that resonated throughout Rome as the one responsible for the capture. The capture of Jugurtha was more than a military victory. It was a move that showcased Sulla's ambition. He was not content with being just another soldier in the Roman campaigns. He wanted to be the one to shape the future of the Republic. The rivalry between Sulla and Marius began to intensify at this point. Marius, who had led the campaign against Jugurtha, saw Sulla's rise with increasing discomfort. The tension between the two leaders was palpable, beginning to draw a future internal battle that would unfold into civil war. On the other hand, Sulla began to stand out not only as a competent military leader, but also as a shrewd politician. He used the capture of Jugurtha to consolidate his position in the Senate, aligning himself with political figures who could help advance his career. However, his growing influence did not go unnoticed by Marius, who began to view Sulla as a real threat to his own power. This competition between the two would shape much of Roman politics in the coming years. In addition to his rivalry with Marius, Sulla also had to face the distrust of many senators who saw him as too young for the position he was beginning to attain. Nevertheless, he continued to use his military victories to silence critics. The war against Jugurtha, therefore, marked the beginning of his rise not only as a general, but also as a political force in Rome. From here, his journey would only become more turbulent and bloody. After his rise in Rome, Sulla faced one of the greatest challenges of his military career: the war against Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, who threatened Roman hegemony in the east. Mithridates, a formidable enemy, had conquered vast territories and assembled a large army, directly challenging Rome's power. With his forces bolstered by alliances with other eastern peoples, Mithridates represented one of the greatest dangers ever faced by the Republic. Sulla, then consul, was chosen to lead the Roman legions in a campaign that would require not only brute strength, but also sharp strategic intelligence. Sulla knew that to defeat Mithridates, he would need to employ tactics that would surprise his enemy, who had already defeated other Roman generals. He began the war with a swift and decisive campaign in Greece, recapturing important cities like Athens and instilling panic among Mithridates' allies. Sulla was relentless with his enemies, and his tactics, often brutal, spread fear. An example of this was the Siege of Athens, where, after a long resistance, Sulla ordered a massacre of soldiers and civilians, sending a clear message to Rome's enemies: resistance would not be tolerated. However, the great test came at the Battle of Corinea, where Sulla faced Mithridates' numerically superior army. Using the mountainous terrain to his advantage and a strategy of dividing the enemy forces, Sulla inflicted a devastating defeat on Mithridates. His ability to exploit the weaknesses of the terrain and anticipate the enemy's movements secured him the victory. Mithridates, previously considered invincible, was forced to retreat. Sulla proved himself a master of maneuver warfare, where his adaptability and keen reading of the battlefield made all the difference. The victory over Mithridates solidified Sulla not only as a great general, but also as Rome's defender in the east. Although the war was far from over, Sulla had already established his dominance and demonstrated that, even in distant lands and against a formidable enemy, he could prevail. He returned to Rome with a loyal army and the prestige of having defeated one of the Republic's greatest foes. However, the internal politics of Rome were about to erupt, and Sulla would find himself once again in the midst of a storm of power and betrayal. As Mithridates retreated, Sulla began preparing his return to Rome, where his rivalry with Gaius Marius would reach its climax. The war against Mithridates was more than a military campaign. It was a test of his strategic skill and resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges. But Rome, as always, would present new obstacles, and Sulla would be ready to confront them. Sulla's return to Rome after his victory in the East was marked by one of the most audacious and controversial events in Roman history, the March on Rome. Never before had a general invaded the Republic's own capital with his legions, but Sulla was determined to break all established rules. The reason for this extreme action was his rivalry with Gaius Marius, who, during Sulla's absence, had consolidated power and manipulated the political forces to resume command of the war against Mithridates. Sulla, realizing he would lose everything he had achieved, made a decision that would forever change the history of Rome. Sulla marched with his legions to the gates of Rome, an act no general had dared to perform before. For many, this was an outrage, a violation of Roman laws and the sacred pact between the city and its defenders. However, for Sulla, it was a necessity. He needed to secure his position and eliminate his internal enemies before they could overthrow him. When his troops entered the city, senators and magistrates had no choice but to yield to Sulla's army. It was the first time Rome was under the direct control of an internal military force. The March on Rome was not only a demonstration of military power, but also a clear message that the Republic's status quo was collapsing. Sulla did not hesitate to purge his political enemies, killing or exiling those who opposed him. His brutal and relentless methods shocked the Romans, but also solidified his rule. Among his targets was Gaius Marius, who, although he had escaped initially, would briefly return to Rome only to die shortly after. The rivalry between the two men culminated in a bloody and definitive manner. From that moment on, Sulla would no longer be merely a general. He assumed total power, being appointed dictator with no time limit, a position that granted him absolute authority over the Republic. Sulla's dictatorship was marked by severe reforms aimed at reinforcing the power of the Senate and limiting the influence of the tribunes of the plebs, weakening the democratic foundations that Marius and others had tried to expand. Sulla was determined to reshape Rome in his own image, and there were no limits to what he was willing to do to achieve that goal. The March on Rome was a breaking point in the Republic's history. Sulla had shattered the rules that had sustained Rome's political stability for centuries, setting a precedent that others, like Julius Caesar, would follow. He demonstrated that, with military power in hand, anyone could rewrite the laws and customs of the Republic. His audacity placed him at the pinnacle of power, but also plunged Rome into an era of civil wars and instability that would last for decades. With the conquest of Rome and his appointment as dictator with no time limit, Sulla was in a position to reshape the Republic according to his vision. He implemented a series of political and legal reforms aimed at consolidating aristocratic power, while weakening the forces he deemed responsible for political instability. The first and most controversial measure was the purge of his enemies, a campaign of terror known as the Proscriptions. Anyone considered a threat to his authority was marked for death, and their properties were confiscated to strengthen the economy under his control. The policy of proscriptions was not only a way to eliminate rivals, but also a method to send a clear message. Obedience was essential, and dissent would be severely punished. Names of senators, magistrates, and even ordinary citizens who had supported his opponents appeared on public condemnation lists. Those who attempted to protect the proscribed individuals were also punished, creating an atmosphere of fear and distrust in Rome. This dark period, however, also ensured that there would be no immediate opposition to Sulla's regime. However, Sulla's reforms were not limited to political violence. He made structural changes to the government system, strengthening the power of the Senate and weakening the power of the tribunes of the plebs, whom he saw as facilitators of popular revolts. By re-establishing the Senate as the central authority, Sulla believed he was protecting the Republic from future turmoil. His reforms also aimed to ensure that no other general could replicate his march on Rome, though this attempt at control would ultimately be temporary. Sulla reorganized the courts and altered the justice system, removing power from popular courts and placing it in the hands of Senate-controlled elites. Laws regarding the election of magistrates were also modified to ensure that the aristocratic classes maintained political dominance. Militarily, he reduced the power of generals, attempting to ensure that military power was more firmly under Rome's control, preventing future leaders from becoming as powerful as he himself had become. These reforms were seen as an effort to return Rome to a conservative order, but Sulla's rule left deep scars. His brutality and desire to control everything through fear and military force would ultimately plant the seeds for conflicts that would arise after his death. Although he restored a certain degree of stability, the cost was high, and many believed that the very concept of the Republic was corroded by his dictatorship. Sulla had secured his absolute control, but he also set the stage for the ruin of the Republic as it had existed until then.